Simon Winchester traveled in the footsteps of many of the men who united the states, and he's captured their stories in his new book of the same name, The Men Who United the States, America's Explorers, Inventors, Eccentrics, and Mavericks, and the Creation of One Nation, Indivisible. And author Simon Winchester is here with us tonight. Welcome. Welcome to Canada.
Thanks for coming here. Thank you.
Your book is called The Men Who United the States, and maybe this is a politically correct question, but what about the women?
Very good. There is only one woman in this story, and that's Sacagawea, who was the Shoshone Indian who, or Native American or First Nation member or whatever we should call nowadays, who essentially guided Lewis and Clark when they met in the Dakotas in 1804. And she was hugely important to that expedition. One might argue that that was the expedition which delineated the extent of the United States, the fons et origo, if you like, and consequently her involvement in it marks her as an enormously important figure on the stage. But then she was the only one. Pocahontas makes a cameo appearance, and some people have said to me in the early life of this book, well, what about Harriet Beecher Stowe and people like that and the early suffragettes? And I said, well, this is a book about the physical uniting of the states, the people that built the railways and canals and the telegraphs and all the roads and so forth. And in that story, there are no women.
Women
it's a
simply
simple
weren't
fact.
involved.
So I could write a book about the women who united the states, but it would, I'm afraid, be a very slender book. And it would only relate to sort of abstract ideas, not physical ideas. So if I sound defensive about this, it's not. I want to rebut the idea that I left them out either willfully or out of ignorance, but there are no women in the story.
Okay. Well, paint us a picture of the United States at the early 19th century. Thomas Jefferson's president. America's doubled its size with the Louisiana Purchase. What does the president of the day want to do with all this new territory?
Well, this is very interesting. And this was a decision he made before he became president in 1785, which is a crucially important date in American history. He decided that Americans should be able to own land. So that's the basic answer to your question. What do you do with all this land? You sell it. You let people own it. Because the tradition in Europe at the time, and in most sort of old world countries, was that people didn't own land. They were tenants to the aristocracy or the monarch or the church, who were the big landowners. But Jefferson thought, no, to prosper properly and to give everyone a chance to participate fully in the democracy that I wish to create, everyone needs to own the land, have a say in how the land is organized. So in 1785, he passed, when he was a senator from Virginia, he pushed through Congress what was called the Land Ordinance, which allowed everyone to own land. And he decided that he appointed a man called Thomas Hutchins, long forgotten, who was the first and, as it happened, only geographer of the United States to survey the land west of the Ohio River. And this man Hutchins did something remarkable, which most Americans know nothing about. He started in a little town, which is a completely forlorn, broken down former industrial town called East Liverpool. It's in Ohio. It's on the Ohio River, in the very north of Ohio, where Ohio, Pennsylvania, and a little sliver of West Virginia meet. And he's decided that this must be the point of origin for a series of surveys which would show what the American landscape was and where it was. And he laid out marker lines, a north-south meridian, which in theory goes all the way to the North Pole, and an east-west baseline, which in theory goes all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So 82 degrees west of Greenwich and 48 degrees north of the equator. And where those lines met at East Liverpool, he put an obelisk, still remains, called the Point of Beginning, which no one in East Liverpool, let alone America, knows exists. Yet that is the point from which, if you fly across the western United States and look down from your plane and see those lines, which if you see them coming out from underneath the wing, if you know they're a mile apart, you can work out how fast your aeroplane's going. All of America is based on this grid, and the grid begins in East Liverpool at this obelisk. So the answer to your question, I know this is very long-winded, is sell the land and make people prosperous.
Okay,
and raise taxes as a result by taxing that land.
All right, we are going to talk about some of the lesser known figures, but I want to talk about two of them that are well known. That's Lewis and Clark. So 1803, Jefferson sets up the Court of Discovery. He gets Meriwether Lewis and William Clark set off to go off and find America, if you will. At the time, what are these two guys, or friends from the war, what motivates them to go do this?
Well, Lewis had wanted to do it for a long time. I mean, he was Jefferson's secretary. He had made one or two sort of failed attempts to try and cross the country. Jefferson was stung, as you probably in Canada know only too well, by reading a book about the crossing of Canada in 1792 by, you will remember the name of the man, it's briefly as
Alexander Mackenzie.
Alexander Mackenzie.
Not the second Prime Minister of Canada.
No, not at all. But this chap had gone from north of the Great Lakes, a furrier, an explorer, and a remarkably heroic man who ended up in the Pacific Ocean, marked with bear grease and soot and things, on a rock near Bella Coola in British Columbia, from Canada by land, 1792, and signed his name. And he then went back to Stornoway in Scotland, where he came from, and said, I wrote a book saying I've crossed the North American continent. I'm the first white man to have done it. And a copy of this book arrived at Monticello, and Jefferson was reading it and essentially said with a sort of great harumph, a Canadian crossed? This is appalling.
How dare they?
How dare they? So we must ignore his efforts, and Lewis, we must do the same. So get yourself some money, get yourself some soldiers, and 32 of them were assembled, and he met his old friend William Clark in Illinois, and they started the expedition formally in St. Charles, Missouri, and then did what Mackenzie had done 10 years before, but did it much more. I mean, they were looking at every single aspect of topography and botany and geology, and drew extraordinary maps, and the story is full of heroism and good observation. And they crossed the Rocky Mountains, and they crossed the Sierra, and they came to northwest Astoria in Oregon.
And as they're doing this, I mean, what kind of knowledge do they have of the new territory? Are they sort of going at it, you know, with a blindfold on, or what do they know?
Well, very little. I mean, there were these extraordinary stories that the interior of America was full of mountains made of salt, that the people extraordinarily spoke Welsh. I mean, where that came from, I don't know. They had a vague idea that there were certain Native American groups, and that they were particularly aware of the existence of the Sioux, and they didn't get on terribly well with them when they met them, first of all, in Fort Mandan in what is now North Dakota. But they amassed an extraordinary amount of knowledge. And if you get from the University of Nebraska Press the complete 7, I think it's actually 13 volumes, 7 main volumes and 6 supplements, the diaries and the observation and the writings were quite extraordinary. So they really added to the knowledge of this new country something quite extraordinary. And
it came to be known as the frontier experience. How did that shape American identity? What influence did it have?
That's a very interesting thought. I mean, it's very controversial. The idea, basically, the frontier is an ever westward shifting line, if you like. Lewis and Clark are somewhat irrelevant to this. They crossed it. They crossed from, quote, civilized colonial America across the Ohio River and pressed westward. But it was when settlers followed them. So we're talking now about the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, when the major expeditions, the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, the California Trail, the Mormon Trail, all set out from essentially Independence, Missouri, to settle the lands of the West. And in doing so, there was this notion of the frontier that was gradually being extended westwards. To the east of it, there was civilization, there was law, there was governance, there was order. To the west of it was wilderness, was the unknown, was savagery. And to deal with this, I'm using their words, not mine, to deal with this, these new people, these Americans, had to think quickly, make rapid decisions, to shoot rather than argue, if you like, to be somewhat bombastic, be somewhat bullying, to be somewhat, the courage, which is hugely important in dealing with getting through this frontier. And people, most notably an academic from Wisconsin in the close of the last 19th century, man called Frederick Jackson Turner, wrote a paper saying that because of this experience, before the frontier closed, in other words, before all of America had been explored and there was no longer a frontier, this made Americans a uniquely different people. Because Europe had never been like this, at least not in recorded history. But America, with this remarkable experience of the frontier, became a different kind of animal. And he was roundly attacked for this, and the frontier thesis is discredited now, except I believe to an extent Americans are different, and partly because of the frontier thesis, they are what they are.
And the adjectives you use, bombastic, I think was one of them. Mm-hmm. You think that we may, if you describe Americans today as bombastic, which many would, you can track that back to this
I think you can, and bombast in certain circumstances is probably necessary. I mean, it goes hand in hand with ambition and pride and aggression and arrogance. I mean, I'm an American now, so I can understand the role that this plays in the forging of a country, but Americans are, I think, and this goes into the whole question of American exceptionalism, which I think we'll probably talk about later, they are different, and I think their experience on the frontier has a lot to do with that.
We are going to talk about American exceptionalism tomorrow.
Okay.
I want to stick with some of the men that you write about in your book, because you travel over 200 years of history. They are, as we've talked about, well-known people like Lewis and Clark, but there's people we've never heard of, many of us have never heard of. A guy named Ted Judah, who played a really critical role in shaping America. Tell us about him.
Well, Theodore Judah, a minister's son from Connecticut, moved ultimately to California, and he had this passionate belief, and we're talking about the 1860s now, that America should be linked by this new thing, the iron horse, the railway. But it was easy. I mean, there was a civil war going on, so you couldn't really have this new railroad touch much of the southern states. There were arguments about whether, in the financing of such a thing, it should be allowed in slave states and so on and so forth. But leaving aside that, the simple geographical fact of how does it cross the Sierra Nevada mountains, the most difficult or impenetrable range of mountains which blocks California from the rest of the country, the Pacific in other words. Well, he was the man who ultimately discovered that the way that the railway should cross between California and Nevada was across this notorious Donner Pass. So he was taken up there one day from Sacramento, where he lived, by a drugstore owner who said, "I think I've found the route for you." And he realized that this was likely to be the route. It would be, for all sorts of technical reasons. He spent a long time drawing a very detailed map of the route that he believed that the railway should take. He persuaded Congress. The railway was indeed built, and in 1869, of course, one of the most important dates in American history, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific joined at Promontory in Utah. But Theodore Judah, poor man, despite being the architect, was not there. He had died of malaria because in those days, to get from the West Coast to the East Coast, you had to go down from California to Panama, go across the Isthmus of Panama, and take a boat up to New York. But he was
called Crazy Judah.
Crazy Judah, because he was so
idea.
impassioned.
Right.
But of course, he was right in the end. And it is a savage irony that he never got to see the moment of triumph that he created in linking the country together by steel.
There's another guy I want to talk about. And like I said, we could talk about so many interesting characters. But Thomas Harris McDonald, what did he do to help unite the states?
He grew up born in Colorado, but Montezuma, Iowa. Father ran a feed store. The roads from the farm to the feed store were just awash with mud, as was most of America. When it rained, there were no roads in America in the early part of the 20th century. He said, we've got to make decent roads in this country. So there was an experiment in Iowa, and then the experiment extended across to America generally, to pave America with asphalt. So he was initially the father of the road system that we know today. And I don't by that mean the interstate system. I mean Route 66 and Route 1 and Route 101, all of them numbered, laid out by this extraordinarily, I mean, he was a very, very difficult man. He always wore a tie and a suit. Even his wife had to call him Mr. McDonald. He was he didn't suffer fools gladly. But ultimately, he became the architect, too, of the interstate system, which is the biggest road build, the biggest construction project in the history of this planet.
Right. Interesting. Plays such a critical role, yet I would wager that most Americans haven't heard about him. No highways named after him. The formal name of the highway system is named after the 34th president, Eisenhower. Why is that?
Well, that is because in 1919, just after the First World War, the generals in the War College suddenly came up with the idea that Japan is becoming rather aggressive. What if they were ever to land on the shores of California? How quickly could we move troops from our bases in the east across to California to meet the threat from this, quote, Asiatic enemy? I mean, how prescient they were, considering that Pearl Harbor was only 30 years later. Let us have a convoy of military vehicles, every imaginable vehicle, jeeps, tanks, armored cars, commissary wagons, assemble them at the White House, get across the country as rapidly as we possibly can, see, in other words, how quickly we could meet this threat of an invasion, and we'll appoint the young half-colonel Eisenhower, young 23-year-old man, to be an observer. Well, it was a complete shambles. It took 58 days for this convoy to lumber across the country because west of Omaha, essentially, there were no roads. There were no bridges. The thing foundered in sand and mud. It fell into rivers. And Eisenhower kept this wonderfully meticulous diary. And at the end of it, said, if I'm ever in a position of authority, and he had no reason to believe he ever would be, I'm going to see that America has a really good roadway system. Well, in doing the research, I got his diary and I followed in the footsteps of this 58-day journey, which was enormous fun, as you might imagine. But golly, can you imagine if they took 58 days? I mean, the Japanese, if they had invaded, they would have taken California, they would have taken Nevada, New Mexico, probably be in Texas, which might, of course, not be an altogether bad thing. Anyway, that's the reason that Eisenhower was ultimately given the name of the road.
Okay, you talked about Route 66, probably the most famous road, Chicago to LA. It wasn't always known as Route 66.
No, I mean, it was the diagonal highway. No one really knew what to call it. And there was an argument, it's a technical argument involving Thomas McDonald again. Roads in America, not talking about the interstates for a moment, the even numbers go east-west, the odd numbers go north-south, and who got 60, who got 70. There was an argument, Kentucky was being offered, I think it was 64 or something, and they said, no, we don't, we want a grand road to go through Kentucky. So a compromise was ultimately reached that Kentucky would be given, I think, US 60, and this diagonal road, which no one thought would do much business, because when it was built, Chicago to Los Angeles, Hollywood wasn't really big news. It was given the number 66 because no one else wanted it, certainly not Kentucky. But as you know, it turned into the most lauded road in America.
Everyone wants to be Route 66 now.
66,
right.
Yeah.
So as you travel, because you traveled so many of these highways, and I'm sure so many things were sticking out for you at the time, but is there a memory that sort of captured your imagination as you're traveling the American highways?
I think there were so many. I mean, US Route 50, for instance, which goes across Nevada, southern Nevada, is said to be the loneliest road in America. And I remember standing in the middle of this beautiful paved highway, because, I mean, McDonald built beautiful roads, and I was there for an hour, and not a single, it was die straight, the kind of road which you know you want to drive at 150 miles an hour. But equally, the only time I've ever tried that, oddly enough, it was in Canada, was on the Alaska highway doing research for this book, and I was pulled over by a Mountie in the Yukon who said, I said, suddenly, I mean, there was no traffic, it was just like the road in Nevada, and he said, welcome to Yukon Road Safety Week, and you're busted. You were doing 125. And I said, but there's nothing to hit. He said, if you hit a moose, you'd be in trouble.
Yes, yes.
So he gave me a ticket. He said, $30 or something.
All right, let's go back to America. What kind of car are you driving across America?
Land Rover.
A Land Rover. Yeah. We all have these nostalgic ideas of what people drive across when they're doing these kinds of things. Okay, I want to skip ahead a couple of decades to talk about two of the most enduring, discoveries, if I can put it that way, and that's radio and television. And interestingly, in Canada, we talk a lot about how radio and television were developed in our country, as they do in the United States. But what was the guiding philosophy when radio is sort of being built across the U.S.?
That's very interesting, and it's something that I think Canada has done much better than the United States. The guiding philosophy in America, once radio was properly invented, and I might say it was invented by a Canadian called Reginald Aubrey Fessenden in Nova Scotia, who was the first person to prove that the human voice could be transmitted.
Say his name again, because I bet most Canadians have never heard of him.
Reginald Aubrey Fessenden.
Let's remember that.
He's a great man. He really is a great man in this story. And the first piece of music he ever, or first human voice that was ever broadcast on the radio was Christmas Eve, 1906, from a transmitter at Brant Rock, Massachusetts, when he played Emmy Leisner singing Ombra Mai Fu from Handel's opera Xerxes to all the ships at sea working for the United Fruit Company and bringing bananas up from Central America to the great American East Coast ports. So that demonstration showed that the human voice could be transmitted, in other words, not just Morse code, which was what Marconi was dealing with after Morse had invented it in the 1840s. Then a radio station opened in Pasadena, and then another one opened in Madison, Wisconsin, and radio took off. And initially, the guiding force was money. Radio is a way of advancing consumerism, and it was almost a license to print money. But there was a sort of still small voice in the 1950s and 60s saying radio could also be used for the public good. It could be educational. And so ultimately, a chap called Bill Siemering in the 1960s and 70s concocted this network of radio stations which became National Public Radio. But the difference was, and the difference between CBC and American NPR is that NPR stations are individual fiefdoms, and so they transmit lots of local news, but they don't attempt in any sense to knit the country together in the way that CBC, in this sort of legendary way, does. I mean, the old story about the housewife cooking dinner in northern Saskatchewan can feel at one by listening to CBC with a fisherman coming home to port at St. John's, Newfoundland. That doesn't happen in the United States. The idea behind NPR is a great one, but I don't think that NPR has successfully knit the country together in the way that it was initially hoped that it might.
We now talk about, the third communication, the internet, and what role it plays in, making the world smaller and connecting us all. What role do you see it playing in uniting your country, America?
Not a big role. I think quite the reverse, as a matter of fact. And I think this is one of the problems that we're going to have to deal with intellectually about the internet, because it goes back, if you like, to the invention of cable television in the 1970s in West Virginia, that up to that point, television and the great national programs, The Tonight Show, The Today Show, and even commercial radio, did, at its height, link people together. I mean, millions watched The Today Show, millions listened to Johnny Carson on the Tonight Show. But then cable television, Mum was watching a program in the living room, children were upstairs watching space programs, father was in the den watching football. It started splitting, the nuclear family started to dissolve under the competing pressures of a multifaceted broadcasting system. And the internet is only adding to that. I mean, you've only got to look at people living in their own little universes now, using their cell phones or their tablets or their computers. So the idea of it creating unity, I don't think it's going to happen. And I think that is a problem, which is why I'm a great believer in radio still.
Thank you. And television as well.
Oh, indeed, and television, yes.
Before we end our conversation for tonight, I want to ask you, you talk a lot about the spirit, the joie de vivre of the pioneers of America. Do you see it still existing today?
I do. I realize that in writing a book about the uniting of the states at a time when, certainly last year, the American Congress was terribly divided, the American government was shut down, there's some enormous political hostility. I still think the joie de vivre, as you say, in America still does exist. I think America will get over this bad period in her life and will return to a sense where Americans realize that they're better than their politicians and that the sense of unity will return.
What characteristic united all the men in your book? Was there something that held them all together?
I think vision and optimism and a belief in a shared opportunity that everyone can do better, but a lot of that betterness can be spread to America as a whole. I mean, you've only got to look at the inventors, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and the unknown and forgotten inventors of the internet, the space program, and all sorts of extraordinary inventions which have brought this country together with this sense of vision and optimism and shared opportunity. I think, yes, I'm very optimistic still.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.